Global PDX was happy to partner with PSU graduate student Matt Wurst on his capstone project, which looks at how local organizations can engage with government. Global PDX is dedicated to keeping our members connected, engaged, and involved with what's going on in the world. And with that, I'd love to pass it over to Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt Wurst. I am a Master of Public Policy candidate this year. I am hoping to graduate in June, so very exciting. For those that don't know, or just kind of a reminder about the MPP, there's two tracks that we can follow. We can either follow the analysis track or the advocacy leadership track. And because I had already had experience in both the Texas and the Oregon legislatures and seeing kind of how policy analysis is done there, I chose the advocacy and leadership track because I felt that policy analysis is a very important part of understanding policy, but also understanding the intangible aspect of how to engage with the community, how to engage with government officials, and the different elements of success that go into that. So there's that. And then before I kind of get into everything, the title is the Glocal org's process for engaging with government. And I kind of want to frame that as it's a puzzle. And it's not necessarily just like a put together puzzle. It could be a maze. The way that I really kind of thought about it was more like it's a video game where you have your end goal, but the way that you get to your end goal can be very, very different depending on the player's strengths, the player's weaknesses, what they choose to invest in, what they choose to level up, and things like that. So that's kind of how I have started to think of policy at its different stages. What is it that I want to focus on? What is it I want to change? Where is that happening? And what can I do to help get there? So I decided to work with Global PDX because last term I did a presentation for them with my global leadership class. So that's how I got introduced to Jennifer. And one of the things that we were focused on is how can we strengthen global PDX within Oregon. And one thing I kind of carved out was how can global PDX better engage with government? Because understanding policy is understanding government. You don't have a public policy or a policy problem or solution without government. And that can be government at various different levels and various different officials. So what Global PDX does is they help connect people from different sectors, whether or not they're professors or people just generally in academics. They could be practitioners, people in government. Sarah's working for the State Department, very jealous. But everyone's got an Oregon tie. They really want to focus on how can we demonstrate that Oregon has a global impact and that it's a positive global impact, and how can we build those connections? So my idea with the presentation is we're going to use policy analysis as a way to have more effective advocacy. So understanding how policy works, understanding policy analysis will help us become better advocates. And the word glocal is a fusion of the word global and local. It really helps kind of convey the importance of both of them. All right. So the overview, it's kind of a step-by-step process. And the next slide, I'm trying to very much mirror the policy process with this. So there's generally 5 stages to the policy process. So the overview is going to talk about problems. We're going to talk about finding the right environment the problem is in, understanding yourself and the organization you're a part of, and then what actual strategies you can engage with, how you're going to go about solving your problem, accomplishing the goal, and then there's sustaining the relationship, because the relationship doesn't end just because the specific project ends. There will be things in the future that need to be worked on. There will be things 15 years down the line you're like, you remember how we did that together? We should do that again. And while that sounds kind of fickle, it's very important in the realm of policy. Because yes. All right, so moving with policy problems, it's important to understand policy within a government context. Like I said before, there is no policy without government. Um, and that's because that's how we as a society have chosen to legitimize policy. That how do you know the law is law? Well, it was passed by the government, and the government's putting it in place. And so understanding uh, government, and we'll get into the different levels in a bit, but understanding that there is a government context there. The next thing is to understand policy domains, because different policies have different aspects to them, and those aspects are also very specific. So, excuse me, the policy domains really show the variety of different impacts that a policy problem can have. And then you have to look at how those different policy domains, how those specialties are going to approach that problem. So someone from group A is not going to approach this problem that's the same way as group B. And then there's the actual policy process. So where is the policy in relation to your goal? And this is where we start getting into delineating the policy process. A lot of what people think about the policy process is kind of a linear. There's a start, there's some stuff in the middle, there's the end. The way that a lot of, the thing that kind of popped in my head was Schoolhouse Rock. We think about there's we have the idea, and then we went to Congress and they did their thing, and I'm just a bill. So this is where it all starts. It starts with the agenda. How do we get people's attention? Specifically the and decision makers. And you move from getting their attention and having the ability to say, okay, this is an important enough issue that we need to address. It's the negotiation stage. And this is where you're debating the different policies. So there are different policy solutions to the singular policy problem. And this is the stage where policymakers, where advocates can try and push and pull the decision makers or the general environment to be like, no, this is where we want our solution to be, not this solution. And once the decision makers and the community can come up with a consensus on a policy, there's some legitimization of the policy. It has to be cool. We all decided this. It needs to be passed by the city council. It needs to be passed by Congress. It needs to get through the Congress committee. It needs to become legitimized somehow. And then after legitimization, and legitimization is not just the legislative side of things, it's okay, we need the governor or the president to sign the bill. There's multiple stages to that legitimization process. Is the implementation process. And this is where we take the policy that was created and we apply it. We try and implement it. We have to make it work somehow. And what's generally considered the last stage is the evaluation, is understanding, did the policy solution that we enacted work? Did it cause any negative externalities? Did it cause a problem we didn't think about? Did it cause more problems? Did it impact different communities in different ways? Understanding the pros and cons of the policy will help us come back and understand, how do we fix it? How do we better solve a policy problem at hand? And while I kind of demonstrated this in a cycle, like I said earlier, a lot of people think it's kind of more of a linear process. To put it more in a 2D process, it's cyclical. You can, you move around. Once you get to the end, doesn't mean you're at the end. But the real insightful way to kind of think about it is it's just really more of a complex web. You can go from negotiation to implementation. You can go from implementation to agenda setting. It's just very complex. And so understanding the policy process is very important to understanding how you're going to get change, because if you're trying to talk about a policy that people aren't aware about, coming into the implementation stage where something is being implemented that's kind of related to your problem is probably not as efficient as focusing on getting it to the agenda. And so to demonstrate the complexity of policy domains, we have our policy problem. We have our various different domains where we talk about, where I'm going to talk, there's COVID, there's international relations, there's wildfire response, very different domains. And then we have our specific problems. There's the problem of economic relief. There's a problem of healthcare aspect to COVID-19. International relations. How are we boosting our trade with other countries? And then wildfire. There's two different ways to combat. There's the preventative way, and then there's the actual responding way. And then we come with our possible solutions, and then we come down with our actual adopted problems. So as a part of the economic relief addressing COVID, Congress passed the Paycheck Protection Program, which supports small businesses. And I went the wrong way. Anyway, so three areas I want to focus on are the Paycheck Protection Program, the allowing former adults in custody to become first responders, and forest management, because while these are listed as policy solutions and actual policies and a policy problem here and these policy domains, when we come and look at different policy domains with different policy problems and different solutions, we see that the Paycheck Protection Program is not just a response to COVID, it can also be a response to the healthcare problem. And how are we going to support local and rural healthcare within the context of the pandemic, which is being addressed through the policy domain of healthcare? That is a way that we can boost local and rural access to tests and vaccines. Here, instead of just thinking about forest management from the state of Oregon's point of view and stopping the fires, we can think about forest management as the actual policy, being chosen by Congress to address climate change through an international agreement. So think about the Paris Climate Accords. While I don't believe forest management is a part of the actual accords that the United States said this is what we're going to accomplish, forest management is a way to reduce carbon in the atmosphere that is being considered as a way to address climate change. And then lastly, while on the last slide we talked about certifying former adults in custody to first responders and wildfire management, here we're talking about certifying former adults in custody for just general job and educational opportunities. So while the wildfire and first responder was a very specific problem and solution, it is also encompassing into the job and educational opportunities and the criminal justice policy problems. So understanding that even your specific solution has a lot of different impacts, it's tied down to a lot of different policy domains and a lot of other policy problems, and you're not just trying to necessarily solve the one thing that you're trying to solve. You need to understand kind of how it impacts everything. And so we move from kind of understanding that policy is complex. It's going to be complex. It takes some digging. We need to understand that, how do we identify the problem that we want to address? And I'm focusing on policy problems. So problems that are either caused by policy or that need to be addressed by policy. And that includes understanding the policy domains. So understanding the problem, is it immediate? Is it happening currently? Does it need to be addressed soon and quickly? Or is it a generational problem? Is it something that people have been dealing with for a very long time? And, have previous solutions worked? Have they not? Did a previous solution create a new problem that is a part of this overall problem? Understanding who is impacted. Is it you? Is it someone you know personally? Is it your family member? Are you trying to advocate on behalf of your children? Is it the community, a group of people that have similar interests or characteristics that are all experiencing a type of problem? Or is it society? Is it something that's really impacting everyone at the same time, or in various different ways? And then you have to identify the parts of the problem. So this is where understanding the complexity of policy domains and actual the domains come into effect. Because if you say I have this problem, but as we showed with forest management, I could be considering that from a climate change perspective, and can be considering that from we just need to manage the wildfire perspective. Both are equally valid perspectives trying to address similar problems with a similar solution. And then who's the facilitator? So who's causing the problem? Is it a department, agency? Is it a type of organization? Is it a specific community that is causing this problem to other communities, or is it individuals? And this is where we start getting into how Global PDX can help us, because addressing policy problems is very difficult. It's, as we've seen, complex. And Global PDX offers an environment for people to come together to help suss out their problems, to further clarify and say, hey, I'm having this. Is anyone else experiencing this? And things like that. So they have working groups where you can start and have people come together and say, we really want to focus on this type of problem that's impacting this type of people. And then you can have other working groups, and then you can have the working groups come together. Obviously, networking opportunities are there. Networking is one of the greatest things about Global PDX, honestly, being able to connect with everyone at an event after the event. And then since the pandemic has happened, their podcast has really become one of the biggest ways that they're engaging with their members and the community at large. So you can broadcast new and demonstrate ongoing different policy problems in different domains at different levels. Moving on from, once we understand the problem and we can identify it, we need to understand the environment the problem is going on in. So thinking about how policy is a puzzle, the way that I'm going to solve policy problems at the federal level is not the way that I'm going to solve a policy problem at the local level. How I'm going to solve a policy problem in the bureaucracy of the state of Oregon is not going to be how I need to solve a policy problem in Multnomah County. They operate differently, there's different perspectives, there's different procedures. So at the federal level, we obviously have the president, Congress, and the Supreme Court. What's important to focus on here is that each has their own dynamics in between them. The cabinet is very political because those are the people that are appointed and confirmed by the Senate, but different departments and agencies themselves are complex. They do a lot of jostling around for funding and for jurisdiction. And then obviously there's just executive action taken by the president. Within Congress, what's important to consider are the committees and the caucuses involved. There's obviously the leadership that's there, but the leadership is limited in their capacity, and that a lot of the bulk work of policy is done via committees or in different caucuses. And by caucuses, I'm not necessarily referring to the political parties. I'm referring to groups of congressmen outside of the political parties. So there's the Congressional Black Caucus, there's the Progressive Caucus, there's, there was the Tea Party that was going on. I don't know if the Tea Party is still an actual caucus, but that was going on in the early 2010s. There's different caucuses that will spring up to try and address different policy problems. And then judicially, we think about the Supreme Court, but there's a lot of action that goes on in appeals and district courts. While it's not easy to impact courts, understanding the decisions coming out of courts and what it is they're saying about the policy and how it's going to impact the implementation or going forward. Do we need to address the problem with different legislation because the courts have said you can't do it that way, the way that you had it? And a lot of that can be influenced through amicus briefs, which are filed to be like, hey, we think you should rule this way and here's why. In Oregon, we get into the legislative and executive dynamics. Kind of important here is that Oregon is very institutional. It's not a closed political dynamic, but it's very different than just your normal legislative dynamic. And part of that is the way that the Speaker and the Senate President operate. Uniquely right now, the Speaker has been there for 5 terms, so she's very comfortable and institutionally set, and what kind of goes on in the House is really, kind of run through the Speaker. And the Senate President, President Courtney, has been the Senate President since 2003. I believe he has announced he's not running for re-election. So, and the Senate and the next legislative session, the dynamics of what is going to go on legislatively it's going to be completely different than what Oregon's basically been experiencing for the past 20 years. We really don't know how it's going to change. And we kind of see how these are impacted through who's being selected as committee chairs, who are the caucus leaders, and the powers kind of given to the committee chairs. Part of why that's important is because when the Democrats have had more power, they tend to give their committee chairs more leniency, but when they've had less power in their chamber, they've kind of reeled it back a bit. In Oregon, there are 5 statewide elected officials, and those are the governor, the secretary of state, the state treasurer, the Bureau of Labor and Industries commissioner, and the attorney general. And this is important to understand because while the governor leads the state, she doesn't have all-encompassing control over state departments and bureaucracies and policy. So the elections that go on in Oregon are completely run through the Secretary of State's office. The governor can try and talk to the Secretary of State, and there may be some more informal ways that the governor can poke and prod at the process, but it is ultimately in the jurisdiction of the Secretary of State. And their terms are even staggered. So it's there to make sure that there is some, independence and accountability between the executive officers, but understanding that there are going to be different policy problems at those different levels. And then we get into local government, which is probably a bit more complex. Within the city of Portland, we have our bureaus, and then there's the city council that's made up of the mayor and the commissioner. Unique about Portland is that it's the biggest city with a commission form of government. The next biggest city that I could find was Bismarck, North Dakota, and they have 60,000 people to Portland's 600,000 people. So there's a very big difference and what's going on there. And even within the Portland area, we see the different types of local dynamics we've seen some city managers, there's mayoral council forms. And so understanding which city, which locality we're dealing with is going to interact, how we solve that problem, what we get going. The counties are very different. The way that Multnomah County and Washington County kind of operate are very different. I hear a lot about it from Sam sometimes about, I just wish that we could work together so that we can help these kids, but the processes are different. So understanding how those are different are going to help you understand how to solve the problem and get through to the solution. And then we get to special districts, which are really fun because they're not direct government entities, but they do have their own powers and they do have their own jurisdictions. And so a very important one in the Portland area is Metro. And Metro and TriMet are two very different things that are both special districts with their own jurisdictions to control transportation and kind of the general regional infrastructure with Metro. TriMet does transportation. But then we get into other things like fire districts. So I've always lived in the Tualatin Valley Fire and Rescue District, but there are other districts there. There's school districts. And so there's just special districts are very, very specific, but they can be controlling the policy and the problem that you're getting at. And so GlobalPDX comes into play again because it's there to help people engage with each other, to help identify how we can help each other, how we can boost the profile of Oregon into global problems and global solutions. So they can host events with local officials. And by local officials, I'm talking about relevant officials here. So yes, interviewing a city commissioner on the podcast is great, but also interviewing Senator Wyden or Senator Merkley, if that were to be able to happen, is also relevant because they are representing Oregon. They have a direct tie-in to solving a problem or a solution, or solving a problem. You're not solving a solution. And then they have a submit a post function, which is a cool thing that it's not just that everyone can just submit a post, but it's a way that different people can share, saying this is what I'm working on, these are the things I'm seeing, this is kind of where it bleeds into a different policy domain, and I can take that and be like, oh, I never thought about it from that point of view. And so really kind of trying to boost the engagement going on between its members. Now we're kind of at step 3, where we want to do a self-assessment and look at the available resources. So we've been able to identify a problem. We understand where the problem is occurring and kind of the dynamics at play of, this is how I need to solve the problem. Um, but here we're understanding, what we have, and undertaking the necessary inventory, kind of checking in to understand, okay, I know I'm going to be weak here in this process, but I will have strengths here. And so I kind of like this graphic because while it's the one whole triangle, each of the separate triangles are equal. And to delve into the specific parts, and again, I like the circle because it's all related to each other. uh, Being able to understand, your members, your experience, the time involved, and the supplies are the four areas where I kind of found are important. So membership wise, understanding whether or not your organization or your coalition is a small or a large coalition, that impacts, things like the supplies that are available or the time that's necessary to be involved. It can impact the division of labor, and the diversity experience. So you can have someone involved in the organization for a very long time and be like, all right, I really understand this. Let me help new people that are coming in that may not know all of the intricacies of a policy domain or the process. Looking at supplies is not necessarily just physical resources. Um, it can be the intangible things like computer or internet access, and where that happens, things that are readily accessible. So you may not currently have it, but you can get it pretty quickly. And then there's the unknown necessities. These are the things that you don't know that you need, but you need to kind of account for. It's kind of like your rainy day fund type idea where you don't necessarily know that you're going to need a hammer, but oh, we need a hammer. So let's figure out a way to get a hammer to solve this problem. There's time. Obviously, everyone has different individual commitments. And unfortunately, government tends to be a bit restrictive in when they meet and how they meet. But uh, if you have a lot of members, it may be easier to follow up on government and see what they're doing. And then experiences, understanding the successes and failures that your members, and the organization have gone through. A big thing that I've kind of gathered and really taken to heart is that there is no failure in the policy process. You may not have succeeded in what you wanted to do, but there's always something that you did that you can improve upon that was good. And so understanding that overall outcome is important. And here, Global PDX can help because they have a lot of resources available if you don't necessarily know where to start. For example, they have a section about donor and funder relationships. So understanding, I need to do something, but I don't necessarily know how to start going about doing that. And I know I'm going to need money. They have resources available there. There's also free and volunteer opportunities that they post. So I understand I kind of want to help with this, but I don't know where to go. They have that. One thing that I really kind of like, even though I did not find my degree on there, but I like it, is the global degrees area. So, because you may have a problem or understand something and it has a global impact, but you may want to invest more in your educational development or want to know more about that specific area so that you can be more effective and go out and build the connections to solve that more complex problem. And so I really like that section there because it gives people the opportunity to see what's actually available for their investment or their organization's investment. And then the other thing is their community allies. This is where you're saying, hey, I'm new, well, maybe not necessarily new, but like I want to be mentored, in this area. This is where I feel that I'm kind of successful, and this is where I kind of want to, improve upon. And they'll help connect you to another member that has that experience that you're kind of seeking for and want to develop, and can, help people come together and find the solutions to the problems. Now that we understand our assessment, we understand where we stand, we understand where we're going to solve this problem, which maze it's in, and the problem at hand, we can actually go about doing it. And this is where strategy is important. And research is kind of its own thing. Advocacy, lobbying, and engagement are kind of the strategies you actually deploy. Research is just kind of involved in all three of them. And so I liked it as an equal component because it impacts all of them. And here, uh, engagement is really kind of the personal connections. It's the one-on-one, it's the investment in the community. You're trying to build that relationship, uh, and understanding the problems impacting people. And again, that could be an actual local community, or it can be a community of people that are facing a specific problem. Uh, and there's that. And then advocacy is kind of more of a general focused push. So yes, you can connect with people, but the way I explained it to someone earlier, it was kind of like voting registration. With engagement, you're just asking people like, hey, are you registered to vote? Do you know that there's an election? Can I help you register to vote? But advocacy is more like, hey, you should vote for this party. You should consider voting in this direction. Um, but you're not necessarily being very specific. You're like, hey, you should vote for the Democrats because X, Y, and Z, but you're not necessarily advocating specific people or specific policies yet. Lobbying is where we start coming in and asking for specific policies to specific people. Uh, and so in this voter registration example, it's, hey, you should vote for Joe Biden over Pete Buttigieg in the Iowa caucus because X, Y, Z. However, one thing to stress a lot about is that if you're an organization, you need to do your due diligence with your research and understand whether or not what you're doing is advocacy or lobbying. Because if you're a nonprofit organization, for example, if you're a 501c3, you cannot engage in lobbying. It is very limited. The IRS does not mess around with that, but you can be another type of, I believe it's a 50c4, they can engage in some type of lobbying activities. They can start actually meeting with uh, local officials and policymakers. So this is kind of where the research comes in. So providing resources of this is how to become a C3 or a C4 and different ways to be involved. And then Oregon specifically focusing on leveraging government here. Government here is much more accessible than they are in other states, even at Congress as well. The accessibility that we've built is very important because it allows for more engagement and advocacy. So, for example, in my time in Texas, to testify before a committee, you have to be in the Capitol building, you have to register that you want to submit testimony before the committee meets. And then if they call upon you and you're not there, then you just lost your opportunity. In Oregon, the way that this works is yes, you can show up in Salem and uh, provide testimony, but you can also submit testimony electronically. So anyone in the state of Oregon can log into um, the legislative information system and say, there's this bill that I like or I don't like, and here are my thoughts on it. And it automatically becomes a part of the committee document. So you can go look up a bill on the system and find out, who's testifying or submitting testimony, the type of groups, you can find a lot of information there. And even just yourself, being able to be like, I don't follow a lot, but I see that you're considering this policy, and this is how it impacts my group and my organization. Understanding electoral changes is also important. Uh, in 2009, the Democrats had a supermajority in the legislature, and then in 2011, at least in the House, it was a split House. There were 30 Republicans and 30 representatives. So the actual electoral changes that happen there impact the policies that can be considered, the policies that are passed, and how they're implemented, and the actual components of the policy as well. There's obviously previous developments that happen. So thinking about uh, what's happened in the past, how things impact the future. So the Democrats, for example, regained a supermajority in Salem in 2019, and we have seen that the Republicans have denied a quorum multiple times, which shuts down the policy process. And now there's a lot of things going on where they take that into consideration. How are we going to account for passing this policy if we just can't work for however long because there's not enough people there. Understanding what happens in the past will impact you moving forward, and grassroots pressures. So things that are going on in the community, in your constituency, in the area is important, but also grassroots pressure can be bigger movements. So we think a great example is the protest around George Floyd's murder last summer. You know, while that happened in Minnesota, Portland was very active in, you know, demonstrating in the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think about the picture where they all laid down on the bridge, you know, 6 feet apart because it was the pandemic, and they all laid down on the bridge for 9 minutes. You know, that was a very um, grassroots movement. And here, you know, checking in again, this is where, you know, when you're staying engaged, you're still trying to go about getting that policy solution in place, providing status updates at the events that you're going to and engaging with is important because you're showing the progress or uh, difficulties that you're coming upon. And at that point in time, you know, while it might not be the same policy domain, someone may have experience like, yeah, you know, we experienced that roadblock when we were trying to pass through a transportation policy. This is kind of how we had to deal with it. Uh, there is a reports page. It's separate than submitting a post with Global PDX, but there's a report page where you can, you know, kind of report on your status updates, what's going on, you know, more formally, and then understanding, you know, like there could be a report on this is what happened in the Oregon legislature in the 21 session, and these are the policies they really considered. Uh, Networking is always important, but one thing I think that it's important because you're coming to Global PDX, you want to engage is understanding your scope and whether or not you need to expand your scope because the problem is too big, or you need to expand your scope because the problem you're focused on is too small, or you need to consolidate your scope because you're trying to focus on something way too big. And so we get to the end, you know, we get through the strategy, some things have happened, but it's not the end. It's not, you know, the end of Schoolhouse Rock, the song is ending. You know, it's moving forward. So building and everything you want to focus on is building on sustained activity. You want to continue your engagement with government and organizations. And a part of that is effectively evaluating what happened. If you aren't open about effectively and objectively looking at how things happened and what you can do to build upon and looking for the future, then you're kind of doing yourself a disservice. And to point out again the complexity of the policy process, at this point in time, if you're an advocacy group, you've gone through the process at least once. You don't have to go back to the drawing board and find a new problem. You understand where the problem is. You understand or what the problem is. You understand where the problem is happening. But now this evaluation is essentially becoming your self-assessment. You're understanding what's going on, how things are happening, and what to do to move forward. And then deltas. I really like this from one of my professors. They always kind of emphasize this isn't the I didn't like this or we failed miserably here. It's we did good and we can do better if moving forward. Looking at the successes and the shortfalls. So shortfalls, not failures. You didn't fail, you just kind of fell short. You did, you learned. Um, Learning is always positive, it's always beneficial, and then learning the teachable moments as well. So as you kind of expand your scope into different advocacy and engagement, you know, understanding like, okay, we can teach about government here and make it more accessible and help expand and let people become more involved. So moving forward, like I don't know how many people were here kind of in the beginning, but this is kind of a step one for my project. I hope to have the report done by the 1st of June. So this is where I'm kind of going to delve deep into understanding those different problems or the stages. And then I have 3 policy analyses coming up. I've got 2 of them done, and I'm focusing on the one with the state. And as Jennifer said, you know, we're recording this, we'll have it posted. So we'll post the report and the policy analyses kind of on the same page and be on the lookout for those in early June. I've also kind of started talking with her about the possibility of a working group so that we can continue helping people and getting people connected. And so, yeah, start collaborating. And that's where we start. And then, I want to say thank you to mom and dad because y'all put up with me more than anyone else. And then Sam, because the last 2 years have been as arduous on her as they have been on me, and I'm the one getting the degree. So thank you. And then, yeah, we can have questions and discuss things because fun.
Well, first of all, I want to say excellent job, Matt. Really great work. Thank you so much for presenting today and for sharing all of this with us. It's really great to see Global PDX looked at from a different angle. So I really appreciate all the work that you did. The first question that comes to mind for me is, we're talking a lot about working groups and what it could look like to bring people together. What would you recommend are sort of the first questions or the first prompts that we bring to a working group meeting? What's a way we can get people started on the right foot?
So one thing I kind of like about the program that I've been in right now is that when we all started our first year, or the first year of the program, our classes are mandated. So we all take the same classes. And then in the second year, we start to branch out. And part of why I like that is because we all had our own policy specialties and domains where we wanted to focus, but we were all kind of focusing on the more central aspect of what is a policy analysis, what is advocacy, what are the ethics involved. So I think that having like a working group that's just focused on what is the policy process going on at the local level or the state level, or if, for example, if Sarah wants to focus on a working group of this is what's going on at the State Department and this is how we do things, so that you're not necessarily talking about just a specific problem within you're not just talking about police reform, you're talking about the different ways that police reform can get done. So here, the interchangeable part is the policy, the problem you want to do, and we're trying to help give people the, kind of the skeleton of the, not necessarily if you do this plus this, you will succeed, but here's different things to try and succeed. So focusing kind of more on different processes and environments instead of policy domains, I think would be helpful, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that's a great idea, and I would love to be on a working group like that. That sounds like a lot of fun. Excellent presentation, Matt. I thought it was super interesting and informative, and I learned something new. I would like to ask you a little bit more about how you think specifically the government agencies within Oregon can better work with the federal government, because I think I've been very surprised to learn just how different we are. I have friends within the state of Oregon government who say they don't even have performance evaluations, and we in the State Department spend half our year writing performance evaluations, for example. We have details where you can go work on the Hill, you can work for the National Security Council, you can work for DHS. Like, we have ways to move within the federal government to better understand the federal government, but nothing really exists, it seems like, that I know of, to connect us to local governments. And especially, Washington, D.C. is very far from Oregon. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can better understand each other, because there's definitely connections.
Right. And so I don't know how much, the caveat is I don't know how much the actual direct departments or levels would interact versus people like you who are a member of the State Department would be able to interact with people at the local level, and understanding and kind of spreading that knowledge. And the only reason I think of that is because while the times that I've worked in the state legislatures, it's been very much no, that is the federal jurisdiction, do not cross that line. No, that is the city level, do not cross that line, because people want to have control over what they feel that is within their power. They like their jurisdictions. They don't like encroachment, and I think that that's kind of just a natural thing. You see that kind of in the federal government. You know, Defense Department or State Department doesn't want to encroach on the Defense Department, even though it might be
we
a
love
similar thing.
encroaching on everyone else's. So I think that's actually, people have pointed that out, that is a really big difference between state and at least the Foreign Service. Because in the Foreign Service, we have an embassy, which is basically a microcosm of government, where we kind of pretend that we're autonomous. You have an ambassador who gets to pretend they're the president. They're not, of course. And we don't make policy, we only recommend policy. But you all work together so fluidly. Even if you have 300 people, it's a lot smaller still than the real federal government. So we very, like with the pandemic, it was literally like, walk down the hall, knock on the CDC's door. What is today's report? Walk upstairs, talk to the ambassador. That it's much more fluid. And I think when we're overseas, we begin to believe that that's how government works. And we come back and we're like, oh yeah, we should just keep doing this. So it does seem pretty different. Like the state, I've heard that people that work for state government are much more fixated on like, this is my job, I'm going to do this job for 20 years. Whereas we are, maybe state is somewhat unique in this, but because we are up or out, like the military, you get people who are really ambitious and interested in change.
I think that's something that, at least in Oregon, I think that I kind of noticed it a lot more because of my time in Texas. But I think that one of the things that's important is to focus on what are the government entities doing to engage. So taking advantage of the processes that are already kind of in place. So the city of Portland has a whole guide about how they can engage, where they want to boost engagement, within the community, what's the appropriate methods to go about this. And that's just the city of Portland. And you can even take what you learn and how you interact with the city of Portland to how you interact with people in the state government. It's not, I wouldn't necessarily say it's that people in state government have blinders on and that they only want to focus on the thing. It's that they're not necessarily given the opportunity to understand the context of what it is they're doing. So I started a temp job with Housing and Community Services, and I am just helping them implement a temp program with landlords. But everything I've kind of been told is like, if it's not inside the program, not your worry. But to me, in my policy mind, I'm like, okay, but this is part of a larger program. And so kind of understanding, and this is why when I came with the leveraging government, understanding that while, people are kind of rigid in state government, there are those processes there are those required, like, no, we have to meet to decide a rule change, or, looking at how government is wanting to engage and taking advantage of that is also important. So not necessarily you having to do all the work, but just taking advantage of the opportunities that are there. So kind of finding the new opportunities.
Awesome, thanks.
Thanks, Matt. I see that Jennifer has her hand.
Yeah, so great presentation, Matt. I also learned a lot. I'm just picking up on what you were saying too. I also just think different levels of government often don't really understand each other very well, and an opportunity, maybe to help sort of local and state government better understand where there are meaningful ways and interfaces to connect with what's happening at the federal level and at the international level. I lead a national policy process seminar in Washington, D.C., where we take a lot of state and local government folks in our executive MPA, and they go get to meet people in agencies and on the Hill, and they come back going, I had no idea that what they do and what I do actually is connected in different ways. So it just seems like an opportunity here maybe to also have some learning sessions where people can just explore some of those connections that they may not realize are there. and building on a lot of the things that you had, in your presentation in terms of strategic opportunities. So that was just an observation I would make.
Yeah, I think that one of the most important things, and that I wish I could, do is, at least in every department, you kind of have someone there that is looking at how what you're doing is impacting others and other policy domains. So that, while it may be only one person, a lot of what I kind of hear about on some of the podcasts I listen to, one person worked for the Obama administration and national security communications, and he's constant. It's not, it's understanding the policy that they chose and how are they going to communicate how it impacts other things and other policies and other people. So, while he was focused on communications, a lot of what goes through his mind when he was in office was, cool, y'all want to decide to do this, but how are you going to relate it? How does it relate to other things? Kind of thinking about that. It's not just this decision. The decision hits other things, changes the dynamics. I think.
Pass it over to Tom.
As a school teacher, I understand that I am in a totally different field than what many of you and what Matt is wanting to get involved with. But one of the things that I appreciate, one of the things that I do try to make sure that our students understand is that whole contextualization piece. Within the public school system, it's so often that a teacher gets told that we don't understand the big picture. You just see what's going on in your classroom with your students. And so the last couple of comments I think are really important, and something that if we're going to talk about increasing our efficiency, we need not only kind of more of a vertical alignment with policy and advocacy, but also that horizontal piece of collaboration. Not that you step on other people's toes, but if one entity doesn't understand what the other entity is doing, whether they're successes or limitations, you're not going to be very effective with your time, with the money that you spend, with trying to affect change. And so that contextualization, I think, is so vitally important in so many different aspects of life. So I was really glad to see that Matt came up with this presentation concept of a puzzle, because that's really what it is. And then for the others of you to have picked up on some of that, I think validates what his research has tried to do. So just my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Allen.
Yeah, apologies for having to duck out. I have something else, but thanks, Matt. Thanks for inviting me, and really wonderful to meet you all. And I will be following your work closely going forward. So thanks so much.
Great to have you, Jennifer. And I think that does just about wrap up our meeting today. Matt, again, congratulations, a job very well done. And we're excited to see the next policy and papers that you drop at GlobalPDX. We already have a couple published, and I'll be sure to share them with all of you so you can take a look. A big round of applause, I think, from all of us. Congratulations. And we look forward to staying in touch with you and implementing some of your recommendations.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us all. Have a great rest of your day.